Good afternoon. Welcome to Kulanu Canada's webinar, The Igbo Jews of Africa, Antisemitism and Genocide. I'm Andrea Spindle, President of Kulanu Canada, a charitable organization that has existed since 2014 with two specific objectives. One is to provide assistance to dispersed and isolated Jewish communities that wish to connect to the global Jewish family, and to educate Canadians about the diversity of our people and the needs and aspirations of isolated communities. We as an organization welcome all Jewish communities that express the desire to be recognized and engaged in Jewish life. Some communities, like the Igbo of Nigeria, are descendants of ancient Israelites. Some are re-emerging, some are emerging, such as Jews of choice. All are important communities, congregations, individuals, and families that Kulanu Canada and our American counterpart, Kulanu, welcome. We thank the co-sponsors of today's webinar, including Kulanu US, the Ludger Center Congregation, Cherut Canada, the Israel Committee of Sonoma County, Stand With Us Canada, the Israel Action Committee of East Bay, the Massachusetts Antisemitism Synagogue Task Force, and New Hampshire for Israel. Kulanu Canada operates with a small volunteer board, and each member has a key responsibility. Several act as liaison for one of the communities that we are currently assisting. Now we are working with Ghana, Suriname, and Uganda. In the past, we've supported projects for Jews in India, Indonesia, Ethiopia, and China. They were all one-off projects, as we don't have the resources to sustain a community or a long-term project, but we have seen results from these projects. So if any listener is interested in knowing more, in donating, volunteering, or in other words, getting more information, please check out our website, www.kulanucanada.org, or in the US, www.kulanu.org. If you'd like more information, please feel free to be in touch with me directly. It's Andrea, A-N-D-R-I-A, @kulanucanada.org. It's now my great pleasure to introduce our guest speaker. There may be listeners who've had no idea that there are Jews in Nigeria, and others of you who may be well informed. It was only in 2004 that I came to know there were Jews in Nigeria. Though I had lived in Kenya and attended synagogue in Nairobi, I was not aware of any African Jews, whether from ancient tribes or newly emerging communities. I was familiar with Ethiopian Jews, the B'nai Israel, as they were rescued by and flown to Israel through several major airlifts between 1984 and 1991. But in 2004, I sought out information on multiracial Jews and was directed to Kulanu. In 2006, I began an ongoing communication through email with a young Nigerian man who was a lawyer, a researcher, and author, who seriously piqued my interest, but more importantly, he was prepared to enter a correspondence with me, answer my questions, and engage with me in his quest for more Judaism in his life, for more Jewish contacts and support in his struggle to bring the Igbo and Am Yisrael together. Remy Ilona was an eager and devoted student of Jewish history and religion, a practicing lawyer and law teacher in Nigeria. I hope he'll tell us what drove him to research the history of his people, the Igbo, an ethnic community that numbers close to 50 million in Nigeria and the diaspora. Several millions live in countries that surround Nigeria, and some are in Europe and North America and beyond. The Igbo have become known to the West as Biafrans because between 1967 and 70, they experienced a genocide brought on by the Nigerian government. Many of you may recall what we spoke of as the Biafran War. On meeting Remy, I was sent his book with an interesting title. It was Jews in Africa, ? And then I was sent a smaller book of the short story from Igbo Israel, and then a book that became quite precious to me, as I assumed it was very rare. It was called The Igbos, Jews in Africa. Only by connecting with Remy recently, this was that book, was I made aware of how prolific he's become, having written over a dozen books. While living in Nigeria, Remy played host and guide to many rabbis and scholars interested in the Igbo narrative, and each found him a willing narrator, an intense researcher and ethnographer who patiently traveled the country to document all of his people's history, beliefs, and religious practices before they were lost. Remy's work became a passion and a vocation and is now culminating in his soon-to-be completed PhD dissertation at the Department for the Study of Religion at the University of California in Riverside. His primary areas of concentration and interest are Jewish studies and genocide and Holocaust studies. He's working on African religions and those in the diaspora, and you will hear of his major project, documenting the Igbo Genocide. Besides being a teaching assistant at the university and caring for his youngest child who lives with him in California, Remy is also Secretary General of an Igbo cultural organization and founder and spokesperson, and I may say this wrong, of the Omenana Defenders, which he will explain. He's among the leaders shepherding the Igbo to Judaism. It's really my delight to welcome Remy. Please feel free to leave questions in the Q&A. You may use the chat to tell us where you are. We'd be interested in knowing where you're listening in from. Thank you. Remy, over to you.
Thank you very much, Andrea. This is the introduction is nothing less than golden. And I'm so delighted to have the opportunity to see you again and to address this, I will use the term congregation, because how else will I address family members? And I will start by saying, I won't call the congregation friends. I would call you family. And even though only a few persons here, like Andrea, Bonnie, David, and Molly, would know me and the Igbos, but that is understandable from the Igbo perspective, because the Igbos believe that it is your relation that is introduced to you, not your friend. So it's understandable that most of the congregation would not know me. But at the end of the day, you would be able to say that you met a representative of family members that you were disconnected from for a very long time ago. So we will get into the story of the Igbos by first looking at their story in pictures and in statements of observers. The guy in blue is the current vice president of Nigeria. He is not Igbo, he is Kanuri by ethnicity. He is a Muslim. To him, some describe the Igbo as the Nigerian Jews. I'm sure that all the Jews in this congregation or in this gathering would know the just departed American Secretary of State, Kissinger. During the time of the mass violence against the Igbo people, to him, the Igbos were the wandering Jews of West Africa, gifted, aggressive, westernized, at best envied and resented, but mostly despised by the mass of their neighbors in the Federation. I'm sure how Nigerians saw the Igbos will remind you of something, how Jews were also seen in the West. In 2022, a Sephardic Jewish organization, the Obadiah Alliance, decided to take matters into its own hands. It constituted a Bedin, which studied whatsoever available about the Igbo people and came out with a ruling. And the ruling is what you are looking at here, that the Igbo people are lineal descendants of the biblical Israelites. That if we want to take a look at how the Israelites of the Bible lived, we should simply visit the Igbos in the more rural parts of Igbo land. These are the insignias of Omenana defenders. And interestingly, the palm tree to the Igbo people is the way of life. And I believe that you may be aware that the palm tree was the symbol of ancient Israel and ancient Judah. to us is the symbol of life. The older guy with a long beard was a very famous seer. A seer was like what Samuel was before he became a full-fledged prophet. This guy gained renown as a seer. When we brought out his photo, he lived over 100 years ago anyway. When we brought out his photograph on Facebook, an Ashkenazi Jewish rabbi who was American, but he is now Israeli, took a look at it and said this was the Hebrew face as it looked and as it will be again. And I think he framed the photograph and kept it because he said the photo looked so awesome. To your right is yours humbly at the kotel. I would say this is how the modern Hebrew would look like. These are pictures of Igbos doing Sukkot. This was how it's done traditionally. Not really like how it's done in very ancient times in the Igbo community, but like 50 years ago, 60 years ago. These are Igbo ladies before one of our older modern synagogues of Rabbinic Judaism. To your right is an Israeli with one of them. This synagogue was put up by Igbos, and an Israeli construction firm, a giant, insisted. The Igbos did not solicit for assistance, but the company insisted that they must roof it. And it comes with a story. Israelis in Nigeria wanted the Igbos to join them in their services, but the Igbos wanted to retain their own organization. So the Israelis decided to help by roofing this building. I was in Nigeria when it was roofed. To the right is Ozoemenan Sube. He has since passed on. He told the story of the Igbos, how the Igbos took charge of developing Nigeria and how they were rewarded with persecution, oppression, and genocide. So he was telling Nigerians to respect the Nigerian Jews, the Igbo people. When we get to the written text, you will understand why this food is here. This food is a carryover from the Passover. This is if you are familiar with Igbo cuisine, you may be aware that no Igbo is comfortable unless he eats something extremely bitter, at least 3 times a week. This particular soup you are looking at is that particular soup that is so bitter, but when it gets into the mouth, it becomes so delicious. That's one way the Igbos ensured that the Passover would never be forgotten. You may be familiar with, to my left, Hazel, and with Right Honorable Dr. Nnamdi Azikiwe, the mentor of most people that fought for independence of their countries in Africa. The first president of Nigeria, the first Senate president of Nigeria, the father of Pan-Africanism in Africa, and the guy who brought Israelis into Nigeria and protected them. He visited I think he was already president of Nigeria by then. He visited the embassy of Israel in London and asked for a photograph with the ambassador before a picture of Hazel, because he saw Hazel as his idol. He saw Hazel as somebody he should emulate. And if we go through his activities among the Igbos, definitely he saw himself as a Zionist. This is a map of Africa and the map of Igbo land. Igbo land is inside that map of Nigeria. I've been Igbo. I think I should read this and then explain. I am 100% Igbo. My family has lived in one compound at one location for at least 1,000 years. Yet my DNA reports showed that my genes and genes of populations in Iraq, Israel, Ukraine, Latvia match. The Igbos and DNA have a story anyway. I just finished a presentation about a few hours ago. I addressed the university itself, and Igbos decided to get into this DNA for specific reasons, which we may get into as we progress with the presentation. I will now go on and read and look at the text to give us further explanations about the pictures you saw. So who are these Jews of Africa? To many of their neighbors, they are the Igbo or Igbo people who are also the Jews. And accordingly, they are thought to be satanic. A video is circulating now. That video came out about 2 weeks ago. A very popular Nigerian made a video that Igbos were born the very same day Satan was born, and that Igbos say that they are Jews. And no wonder why they are so bad, because they are Jews, and that is why they decide to work with Hitler. That video came out about 2 weeks ago, and this guy was simply repeating what is part of the culture. Who are these Jews of Africa? To many of their neighbors, they are the Igbo people who are also the Jews, and accordingly, they are thought to be satanic, inherently domineering and evil. To themselves, they are the Hebrews or the Israelites. 100 years ago, if you heard the term Jews of Africa, that meant just the Igbo people. In the middle of the 20th century, I believe that the Igbos were the only group outside Europe who did not only reject the identity Jew, even though it was linked to money, evil, and used to mock and persecute them in their country, but they proclaimed happily that they were Jews. This is very important because the Jewish identity today has the identity, that term Jew has become a normalized, routinized, even honorable term. The state of Israel is a successful country, is a state of Jews, so it's okay now for people to want to be Jews, but I don't know who was happy to be called a Jew 70 years ago, when what you knew about Jews was Shylock. But the Igbos happily declared that they were Jews then. And I think this is very important because people look at the sentiments of today when the Jewish identity has become something that people like, and push it back to 100 years ago when Nigerians came up with, if you know a Nigerian, ask him what a Jew man means. To Nigerians, Jew man means somebody who is uncivilized, backward, evil. And that was when the Igbos went about beating their chests. We are Jews. The Igbo people were the people who established the first sovereign Hebrew confederated states after the Roman destruction of Judah. You can call them the Hebrews or Israelites. Igbo is just the way of pronouncing the term that is Hebrew in the English language. The Igbo people were turned into one of the Nigerian peoples when Imperial Britain conquered their Confederation of Hebrew Republics between 1880 and 1910 and added them to its imperial empire. They were largely known as Biafrans, Igbos, and Jews of Africa when the Nigerian state carried out the second worst but largely ignored and marginalized genocide of the 20th century against them between 1966 to 1970. Presently, those of this ethnic group who still retain Igbo as first identity and still have family in Igbo land, Nigeria, number at least 50 million. Sadly, their dispersion reminds us of the dispersion of the Jews. Presently, there are very likely more Igbos than members of any other nation scattered all over the world. If you find a shopkeeper who is Black in Japan, China, Rangoon, Russia, then most likely you are looking at an Igbo. We are still trying to figure out when Jews of Africa became one of the identities of these people. What we know is that as far back as 1670, that's about 500 years ago, James Ogilvy, a British cartographer, the monarch's cartographer indeed, had written that European explorers found some people in Igbo land who boasted that they were children of Abraham. We also know that many studies, some more than a few centuries old, some done by Igbos themselves demonstrated that the Igbo way of life and the Jewish way of life are strikingly similar. Olaudah Equiano comes to mind. This gentleman rose to become one of the first three most important abolitionists. He was kidnapped at the age of 9, humiliated, dragged throughout the Western world, stayed in the Caribbean for some time, stayed in the American colonies. Eventually, he found himself in Britain, where he worked for a long time, bought himself back, that is, bought his freedom, and wrote a book 239 years ago. And in this book, he compared the culture of the Igbos and the culture of the Jews. He said these two peoples obviously came from one source, but he could not understand why their colors were different. What I found most impressive in the book was he talked about the Passover, and that was why I showed you the picture of that particular food that we kept on eating every week so that we will never forget the Passover. And instructively, the Igbos and Jews have always found themselves pushed to one corner. When a few years after World War II, Nigerian anti-Semites banned Israeli Jews from some cities in Nigeria, they also restricted and banned the Igbos from those cities. 999 out of every 1,000 persons who adhere to the religion called Rabbinic Judaism in Nigeria is Igbo. I have yet to see any Igbo who practices Rabbinic Judaism, which by the way, the Igbos are on the verge of making a religion of millions of people in Africa who does not believe Judaism to be an organic offshoot of Omenana, which is the traditional religion of the Igbos. I think we need to spend half a minute talking about Omenana. Omenana is the traditional religion of the Igbo people. And instructively, in whatever language the ancient Hebrews used, what they called their religion, when I talk about the ancient Hebrews, I'm talking about Moses, what they called their religion was Omenana. We will see it clear in this presentation. To the person who has deep knowledge of the actual history and culture of the Igbo people and the biblical Israelites, which unfortunately most people do not know much about, the Igbos are the linear descendants of the Israelites whose culture still reflects the culture of the patriarchs, priests, prophets, Levites, and the Israelites of the Bible. Again, I say, prepare for some surprises. Some decades ago, I was born at Uru Okwe. Abraham, the patriarch of the Israelite people, was born in Uru, Chaldea. Uru in the Igbo, Akkadian, Ugaritic languages that we believe Abraham spoke mean the same thing. It means location or city, also in Hebrew, which is the language that we say that Abraham's descendants spoke. After my birth, my mother went into Omugwo, seclusion as the ancient Israelite woman did. After 2 months, my mother went to the river to have a ritual bath. On the 8th day, I was circumcised during the ritual of Igbo. I grew up with children of Levites that my Dayanim George family, my family in my republic, we have been judges for 500 years, has accommodated for over 200 years. We have accommodated this Levite for 200 years. In my time, the father of this Levitical family was a man called Asomba. He was born the very same year that my father was born. His name means somebody that can live everywhere. Remember, the Levites were supposed to live everywhere. Samuel, who succeeded Eli the prophet, the family were Levites, but they lived in the territory of Benjamin. We would find his story in the book of 1 Samuel. Remember the boy that Hannah conceived after some issues. This family was received by grandfather Ezofido Ilona, who was Nze, as was the biblical Samson. Samson was a Nazarite. The tradition and the word for the tradition survives among the Igbos. It is called Nze, somebody that must shun and avoid evil. You know, Samson was supposed not to eat some things, was supposed to be a holy man. That tradition survived full time in the Igbo culture.
Remy, do you have slides? Sorry to interrupt, but I think you have other slides you want to move forward.
Yeah, I'm still in the history. Yes, I'm still in the history. The English language will substitute Nazarite for Nze. I participated in the Jubilee as a Mwiri. As a child, I joined others to mock the goat of Azazel. I participated in many first fruit offerings at New Yam festivals. I saw the celebration of Sukkot called a Mantu in Umuoji. Read Things Fall Apart by Chinua Achebe, who, though he had a Christian orientation at age 25 when he wrote the book, discussed Jacob and Absalom and their flight to their mother's homesteads, portrayed as Igbo characters without consciously and intentionally telling a Hebrew story. Many of our idioms, even in 2024, are the usages, idioms of the scribes who wrote the Bible. To the ancient Israelites and other Semites, to marry was to cover with a garment, ima ogodo. To cover with the cloth is the basic Igbo expression for marriage, which, like mourning, must be done under a canopy. When I was barely 3, my father, who was Joseph Ilona, told me that we were Hebrews. My mother repeated the same thing many years later, but before then, I had become the expert on this particular subject of the Igbos and the Israelites. Both have since returned to our ancestors. My father in 1992 and my mother in 2006. We mourned both for 7 days, and on the 28th day, we held Izuozu, which Jews call Shloshim. We continued a lower degree of mourning for 1 year, and at the end, we took off Akwoju mourning clothes. People who have read the Hebrew Bible very carefully think that the religion and culture of the biblical Israelites does not have what can be called a name. They have. The name is what Igbos call religion and culture. The phrase in Igbo is Ome Nana. To confirm, read Deuteronomy 6:1 in any language. It says, "Now this is the commandment, and these are the statutes and judgments which the Lord your God has commanded to teach you, that you may observe them in the land which you are crossing over to possess." Omenana means religion and culture you do in the land. The Igbo word for light is Urimu, which is also Hebrew for light. There are very deep connections between every 15 out of every 20 Igbo words and Hebrew words. 239 years ago, well, we already referred to Olaude Equiano. And what we used for to remind ourselves of the Passover. So no need of going through that in the history again. And through the DNA, we have gone through that. So we will now proceed and look at the story, more stories of these people in pictures. The second part of this presentation is about anti-Semitism, while the third part is about genocide. I'm sure that if you are very familiar with the history of the Yishov, you will remember the guy in the middle. There we are three guys in front, there we are three guys, two were in military uniform. And of course, Adolf Hitler is somebody everybody in the world should recognize clearly. The guy in the middle was the late former Grand Mufti of Jerusalem. He fought the Yishov, continued fighting the re-established state of Israel from when he was 20 to the time he went to Berlin, joined the Nazis, used shortwave radio to broadcast Nazi and Islamist anti-Semitic hate speech against Jews to when he passed on in 1974. What he was distributing, what he was broadcasting, entered Nigeria and helped to inflame Nigerians against the group that had been known as Jews of Africa. What this guy was broadcasting from Berlin, and after World War II, when he relocated to Egypt and ultimately died in 1974, was entering Nigeria. We would see more in slides. You would recognize probably the lighter skinned guy. That's the late former president of Egypt, Nasser. He was also a noted anti-Semite. Here he was in this picture with the late former premier of Nigeria. This was the guy who banned Israelis in Nigeria from visiting certain cities with Nasser. And these individuals I'm pointing out to you had rock star status in Nigeria. And since the rhetorics coming from the Nazis was kill all the Jews, they are domineering, they want to take over the world. And there in Nigeria, you have a group that was not only seen as Jewish, loving money, domineering, but that group was not denying it. So it was a question of time before what followed the Ashkenazim in Eastern Europe began to follow the Igbos. Here you can see the two rock stars waving to cheering crowds in Nigeria. So we would go back to the history again to get more insight into this anti-Semitism we talked about. To the British, the Igbos were the inherently pagan people in Nigeria. They were also inherently cannibalistic, forcing one to think of the infamous anti-Jewish blood libel slander. Igbos were the only group the British invaders and colonialists singled out for demonization of their religion and were attacked. Singled out their religion for demonization. While in Nigeria, the Yoruba religion and Islam were protected. Is it not ironical that Britain, a Christian country, protected Islam and went as far as blocking Christian missionaries from going to areas where Islam was dominant? But for the British, Igbos were thought to be inherently evil, even though an extremely hardworking, very intelligent people. Also, the British viewed Igbos to be by nature a domineering people. Igbos did not invade Britain or any of the neighboring peoples. In fact, Igbos did not have a standing army. They were in fact invaded by many of their neighbors who, like the British, were imperial and colonialist. British characterizing of Igbos as domineering was inciting, and together with the others' loss and the fact that Igbos worked very hard, which led to their visible improvement, certainly incited Nigerians. Many Britons, most of whom were already prejudiced against anyone with a Jewish identity, did not help the situation. As I have observed, and I believe I'm right, the Igbos accepted and declared that they were Jews. Oh no, it's historical, so no point in saying that I believe I'm right. The Igbos declared publicly that they were Jews. While in many parts of the world, due to persecution, the Jewish identity was not something that people flaunted, but in the case of the Igbos, they did not only deny it, but they flaunted it. The Azikiwe that I showed you, who was known as the Great Zik of Africa, declared in 1950 that the Igbos, like the Jews of the world, would lead Africa to freedom. And that was somebody the whole world listened to. After Israel's independence, when Israeli Jews were turned into a pariah by the Arab Muslim countries, and Jews were looking for friends in the world, we must recognize that it was Dr. Azikiwe, the Igbo leader, who was also Nigeria's president, who opened the door to Nigeria to Israel in the face of opposition from many quarters. He had to intervene before Golda Meir was allowed to visit some parts of Nigeria. Before Israel's independence in 1950, the Great Zik, or Zik of Africa as he was known, as the head of the Igbo leadership and some Israelis, had aligned some of the aims of the Igbo and Ashkenazi Jewish nations. The primary aim was for both to work together with other Nigerians and African nations to develop the long-suffering African peoples. All these did not win Igbos friends and love in many quarters. But remember, a few years before all this, a culture was taking root in the world. That culture was eliminate all the Jews in the world. That was certainly what the Nazis preached. And there, in the middle of Africa, you find a group not only saying we are Jews, but receiving survivors of those same people that we are marked for destruction. Many people who viewed the Igbos as evil, money-loving and domineering because they were seen as Jews, and which they did not deny, only hated them more. When Israelis, we had looked at how Israelis were banned and Igbos were also banned in certain parts of Nigeria. But what happened was, because it was the country of the Igbos asked those Israelis to come to their own region and work. Everything I'm saying are things you would find in the archives of the State of Israel. Some of them are already published. If you are familiar with Daniel Lees, a Swiss-Israeli anthropologist who wrote a modern history of the Igbos, most of what I'm saying are in his book. Many Nigerians had been Muslim for many centuries. Millions of Nigerians were Arab Muslims. Nigeria has Arab Muslims. But after the British came, millions of Nigerians became Christians. Islam and Christianity have cultures which parts of somebody who wants to be anti-Semitic could find room in these two religions to be anti-Semitic. With the Igbos, one of the largest ethnic groups in Nigeria, self-identifying and being accused of being Jews, it would have been strange if anti-Semitism did not become part of the culture in Nigeria. It certainly became that. After World War II, the anti-Igbo Israel and the anti-Igbo hatred hardened. Before the Holocaust, to many powerful Nigerians like their fellow British elites, it was assumed the Igbos wanted to dominate everywhere and were to be feared and kept down, only kept down. This continued, and after World War II, gradually millions of Nigeria began to accept the idea that Igbos, these Jews, these evil people, deserved to be removed from the regions of Nigeria that were outside the traditional Igbo homeland. This belief, which many highly placed Nigerians expressed openly, and which was followed with bans against employing Igbos, seizing lands they had acquired legally in their own country, should remind us of the anti-Semitic rhetoric of Goebbels, which flowed into Nigeria from the Third Reich through the Levant, and the raft of anti-Jewish measures the Nazis had adopted and implemented before the Holocaust. The pictures, you saw some of the pictures already, so no point in showing them again. The people that preached this hatred all the way from Berlin to the people that preached it in Nigeria and implemented some of the measures like banning Israelis and banning Igbos, you are still looking at their pictures, so we don't need to scroll back. And I've already mentioned how the Grand Mufti broadcast from Berlin, so we already have that picture. Then we would go back to the genocide itself now. We will look at the genocide first in pictures. What do this remind people of? Auschwitz. It certainly reminded people of Auschwitz. These were Igbos. This one has a story. He survived, unlike millions of others. You could see the guy. He was shackled. He eventually became the president of Gabon. He was overthrown last year. The president of Gabon adopted him. By then, the president of Gabon had not gotten a son. As the Speaker of Parliament, when his father died, he succeeded his father and he was president of Gabon for over 15 years. I'm not sure exactly of the number of years he was president. What was happening was that Igbos could not care for hundreds of thousands of orphan children. So the planes that managed to break the cordon of blockade and fly into Igbo land, these Igbo kids will be put in them and flown to neighboring Gabon. This guy managed to survive and was adopted by the president and became president. That's Joseph's story again. I think Steven Spielberg should be thinking of, if he sees this, he will think of Schindler's List, Part 2. I told you it certainly reminded people of something. The Holocaust. Elie Wiesel said he could not cry, he could not sleep. That he thought he was in Auschwitz again. He wrote about it in the book, A Jew Today. Ethnic cleansing preceded the actual killings. What is ethnic cleansing? Is try and get rid of people. These were Igbos who managed to escape being killed. To the right was a young Jew, Bruce Mayrock. He complained bitterly that he had protested, but nobody wanted to listen. He burnt himself alive. A garden was commemorated in his honor in Igbo land last year. Danger of forgetting and overlooking anti-Semitism. I'm sorry for bringing this important story to light because some people may be upset. Igbo victims of the Igbos who passed through this when you talk to them, they said it's not something they want to remember. So I know that there are people who, Holocaust survivors, whom these pictures may upset, but it's important that we remember so that there will not be repeats. The necessity for not forgetting occurred to me as I engaged with my present work, the Holocaust of Biafra, anti-Semitism and genocide in this genocide we are looking at, in which I argued that the Nazi Holocaust continued to be implemented through the genocidal wars against the Ishav. Genocide is not only when you succeed. When you think of getting rid of a people, you have committed genocide. When you force a people to leave their culture, force them to become warriors, you are already guilty of cultural genocide. Through the genocidal wars against the Ishav state of Israel, the mass killings that took the lives of 3 million of our people in Nigeria and Biafra, and the endless ordering and scapegoating of the people of Israel, I came to realize that we must acknowledge all such anti-Semitic horrors and never forget our entire history. As I worked on the history of the Igbo people, it gradually dawned on me that the Igbo genocide happened because people forgot or did not remember the Nazi Holocaust as we should have. I came to this realization as I continued to work on this project, which would now have come to life if Professor Michael S. Alexander, the Maimonides Chair of Jewish Studies, University of California, Riverside, had forgotten the 6 million. If Alexander had forgotten the Nazi Holocaust, he wouldn't have seen why it is important for the Igbo story to be told. He wouldn't have noticed that any hint of anti-Semitism concerning a people who had been called Jews for hundreds of years and who eventually suffered genocide was not something we should have thrown overboard. That was why the story came to life. As I read and wrote, it gradually dawned on me that the cases of anti-Jewish mass violence, which I listed, were in some ways one project, which we can call Project Elimination of the Jews from the World. This project is still alive and will remain alive as long as anti-Semitism and ignorance are alive. Its potency is demonstrated by the fact that most people in the world do not see the oddity that only Jewish nationalism, which interestingly is not and has never been imperialistic, is questioned. Anti-Semitism is a cancer. It poses a threat not just to us, but also to the rest of humanity. We must bond together for our goods. And I think we are beginning to do the right thing at last. Prior to Biafra, prior to this genocide that destroyed the Igbo society, when the economy of the Igbos was the fastest growing economy in the world, this is historical, the government of the state of Israel and the government of the Igbo people had a program called 10-10-11. This program was to bring all Igbo children from the age of 10 to the age of 11 and Jewish children all over the world to the age of 11 to bring all of them together. I learned of this program when I went to the Israeli embassy in Lagos. I was waiting for my turn to see Uri Savia, the counselor, a very good-looking Igbo man. I was in my early 20s then. This Igbo man would be like in his 50s. He also walked into the embassy and asked me why I was there. I explained why I was there. He said he's here to see if the Israelis will be interested in reviving 10-10-11. I said, what's 10-10-11? Biafra was before my time. He told me about this program. 10 minutes later, he walked out. He said they were not friendly and they were not respectful. But from what we can see here, some people are doing the needful, bringing them together. They should be brought together. Yours humbly with Nathan Sharansky, this is still the rapprochement. And with Dore Gold, formerly Netanyahu's Director General or Ambassador to the United States or the UN, with Amare Stodmeire, Jewish, with former Miss Israel. Unless I will now give the textual reasons why we must bond together, the reasons that I prepared. Unless we want to remain blind, we must admit that between 1939 and 1970, anti-Semitism took 9 million, if you like, say Jewish souls, if you like, call them Igbo souls, because as far as I'm concerned, the Igbo is the Jew and the Jew is the Igbo. Even if we do not see other reasons to bond together, anti-Semitism and what it represents, a danger to our way of life, cherished Western values, and peace, as well as a threat to all of humanity, should force us to. This fact should force us to discard whatever stops us from recognizing one another as brothers and sisters and come together to address our common problems and enemies. Do we have to incur more losses before we take serious notice? We do not know if one among the 9 million that we are murdered could have found a cure for the cancers of anti-Semitism or of malignant tumors. If the Holocaust in Nigeria and Biafra had lingered beyond 1970, it might have still swallowed me. And so would have died some of the things I have done and the project I'm presently working on, which in essence is bringing reconciliation and peace between all streams of Jews. I've asked and found answers to many questions that needed to be asked. Why is Jewish nationalism the only nationalism to be forever questioned? Why are people not questioning why a Jewish presence, any kind of presence in Palestine, was rejected at the end of the 19th century? There are no easy answers, but take to the bank my thought that anti-Semitism against lighter-skinned Jews has fused with anti-whiteness. And since the world has been misled to accept the falsehood that only, quote, white people have done evil things in history, and Jews have been constructed as whites, anti-Semites who have become anti-white and who see the state of Israel as a white colonialist state have convinced themselves that they see Israel doing what quote, white people have done throughout history, even when what it is doing is defending itself. But though, quote, whites have largely held more power than other groups of humans over the past 1,000 years, quote, whites have not held any monopoly on doing evil things. The trans-Saharan slave trade, an Arab misdeed, was not less heinous than the transatlantic slave trade. Many of the kings, emperors, and chieftains in Africa, venal, brutal, and corrupt as their peers in Europe, also bear guilt for the unjust enslavement of African peoples. We must be creative to find ways Igbos and Jews could start to work together productively to fight anti-Semitism and other sources of hate. If we can do this, it means that 50 million Igbos and 15 million Jews will be on the same page in the fight against anti-Semitism, which hitherto 50 million Igbos have been excluded from participating in, even though they are victims. Even though Igbos are as much victims as Jews, but Igbos have been said, you don't matter. Primarily because they have been left out of the discourse. I'm using this opportunity to inform Jewish organizations, appealing also, starting with the NGOs, that are becoming familiar with Igbo history, as well as local federations and synagogues that may be willing and ready to work with Igbos, that they will find a worthy, ready, and capable partner in the Igbo group of men and defenders. The group is the sole Igbo group equipped and committed to rebuilding the Igbo people as a branch of the people of Israel, to remove roadblocks that to men and defenders, aliyah to Israel is off the table. From experience, we know that, unfortunately, even though everywhere Igbos go, I think people should be happy that Igbos dwell among them. But so far, the state of Israel thinks that all the Igbos will want to go to Israel, and that has been a barrier to rapprochement. So to men and defenders, the body that is interested in this rapprochement, aliyah to Israel is off the table. I think it's better to state it up front. The fear that Igbos will make aliyah to Israel is a greater impediment to Igbo Jewish rapprochement than racism. It has meant that Israel denies that the Igbos are Israelites, and this has also forced well-meaning rabbis to ask Igbos who desire to convert to Judaism to sign an undertaking that they will not argue that they are eligible for aliyah. This has happened. To men and defenders, the two groups should first find ways to know one another. Education is very important. The two peoples should begin to study and learn about each other with respect. So far, many Jews have been misled about the Igbos by the, quote, exotic caricatures put out by members of the media and a few academics. I'm saying that the Ashkenazi, Sephardi, Mizrahi, Beta Israel would know that they are also Igbo. And the Igbo would also know that they are Ashkenazi, Sephardi, Mizrahi, Beta Israel, after Igbos and these other Israelites have begun to study one another. Many African Americans and Caribbeans who are Hebrew Israelites have discovered that they are of Igbo stock and have studied this history, which you are getting just a snippet of. They too came to the realization that in fact, they and the white Jews share ancestry and should not be in conflict. I intend to share this information with former NBA star Amare Stoudemire, and I will ask him to send it to rap mogul Kanye West and NBA star Kyrie Irving. We had the entire world know what happened last year when Kanye and Kyrie said some things that were unfriendly to Jews. These guys could be Igbos. I've also seen many Jews who became very familiar with Igbo history and culture and learned that African Americans and even those Hebrew Israelites are Igbos. And automatically they began to see these people as family members. So we can never underrate the advantages of coming together rather than staying long distances and casting angry eyes at one another. The scourge of anti-Semitism affects all of us. Jews or Igbos of all colors and ethnicities, from all nations, levels of religiosity and political perspectives. We must replace ignorance in the mainstream world of the people of Israel with knowledge about the diversity of our people in order to address anti-Semitism together. The enemy of both the Igbo and other Jews is a scourge on all humanity. Finally, family, I'm asking for a favor. Those who are engaged in outreach among you would be helping Igbos if you relate to Igbos who have begun to follow Rabbinic Judaism as just Igbos, or Hebrews, or Israelites, or Jews, instead of Nigerian Jews, African Jews, Sub-Saharan Jews, or reimagined Jews. These identities are not our identities. And the Igbos that our brother Jews deal with may not tell them that that these identities don't speak to us. When an Igbo is referred to as an African Jew, that Igbo is alienated from the Igbo people. And I know they don't share with you that it is not possible for them to form a separate community. If you are a Muslim, if you are a Christian, if you are a Jew, you are still, as I mentioned in passing, I've been on one piece of land for 1,000 years. We are rooted to the land. Everybody is connected to that land. So whatever religion you take on, you are still, Omenala is still your primary religion. And you are connected to that land where every Igbo must be buried for today. So when these brothers and sisters of ours are regarded as African Jews and they become used to referring to themselves as African Jews, when they approach other Igbos and call themselves African Jews, those African Jews look at them as strange. Look at them as people that are denying our identity. For the Igbos, considering the long time we have been known as Israelites, if you refer to them as Israelites, they will not be sidelined in the community. They may not tell you, but these strange identities, African Jews, Nigerian Jews, Sub-Saharan Jews, or reimagined Jews, alienate them from themselves, their history, culture, and the wider Igbo community, which they are a part of, and which they should not be sidelined in. They are neither respected by self nor others if their real identity is marginalized. We cannot say that the Igbo story fits any of the listed categories. When and if ever the state of Israel wants to see the question of the other Israelite states, the Igbos had a state. When and if ever the state of Israel wants to see the question of the other Israelite state as a serious one, it should open a ministry of Igbo affairs. 50 million Igbos who have endured everything I have mentioned should not be swallowed up in amorphous groupings that do not speak to them. I would love to see Mr. Jeremiah Danzig and Rabbi Gedalia Gafen as directors general of such a ministry. The men and the defenders as different departments for Ashkenazim, Mizrahi, Beta Israel, Sephardi affairs, African American and Caribbean Igbos, because our connections to each is different. On genocide, we can speak with the Ashkenazi. We can be on the same page with the Ashkenazi. On the pain of exile and being marginalized, we can talk with the Sephardi. That's why the Sephardi, we are able to see that they were able to see that it's a misnomer for not only Igbos, not only ignoring Igbos, but also to deny that they came from Israel. The Obadiahs, a Sephardi Jewish organization which constituted the Bedim, acknowledged that Igbos are linear descendants of the Israelites. It took a necessary step towards eradicating the abominable denial that the people whose everyday practices mirror those of Jews are not Israelites. The image you saw of kids at summer camp in Nigeria 2023 is what the future should be like. Igbo, Israeli, and American Jewish kids together. This will be revived. Igbo leaders and other Jewish leaders interacting respectfully with the aim of solving their common problems and cooperating with that silent majority that are not anti-Semitic, and act to eliminate hate in the world. Israel's children in many countries will exceed 100 million. We need to eliminate unnecessary divisions and unite, which is what we learn from the evil of anti-Semitism that affects us all. I'm the Secretary General of Men and Defenders. Our website is up. My phone number and emails can be gotten from Andrea. And here, I say thank you to you for listening. And on this note, I yield.
Wow, thank you. So we have a number of questions. I want to thank you very much on behalf of everybody for a great presentation, a ton of information for people to digest. And I'm happy to see that we've had people from really many countries around the world and a number who are Igbo who are very curious now to find out more about their own Jewish Israelite past. So I will make sure that if they get in touch, we'll put them in touch with you. And in fact, I will keep, I'll ask David, who's with us, to save the the chat and the Q&A, and then I can actually share that with you, and you could reach out if you like, Remy, if that would work for you. Okay. So
Sure.
I'm going to ask a couple of quick questions that might be easy to answer. I think one that I've always found interesting, for those of you who remember a famous Nigerian writer, was Chinua Achebe Jewish?
Yes.
That was
Every Igbo in the world, because you are used to the term Jewish, so I will say he's Jewish. Just like every Jew is a Jew. You cannot stop being Jewish.
Did he recognize it? Did he own it?
He owned that he's Igbo.
Okay. But what I think people are asking is, of the 50 million, what percentage actually see themselves as part of the Jewish world? Even I understand that being Igbo makes you Jewish, but do they identify with the history and today's people who are practicing Judaism?
This presentation is so awesome because, as I said, so many surprises will come up. Every Igbo understands that being Igbo means to be Israelite. But because when you bring in the term Jewish, they may be thinking you are thinking of Rabbinic Judaism. Because the Igbo who is Catholic still says he came from Israel.
Uh-huh. Okay, so they recognize it as their historical roots, right? Are there, now I understand that even today, and someone mentioned it in the chat, there is an increasing persecution of those who are practicing and have open synagogues in Nigeria. Can you talk about that, about anti-Semitism today?
I will still recommend, the Igbo people have always been the group that suffers anti-Semitism in Nigeria. It's not limited to the people in the synagogues. Nigeria has been anti-Semitic, and it's not going to stop soon. And it's something the entire Igbo people suffer from. But there are targeted killings of Igbos today in Nigeria, not that I know of.
Okay, I thought maybe I'd read that several synagogues had actually been invaded or shut down.
At this particular time, I did not hear about that.
Okay. What, if any, challenges have you had in doing this research and in bringing the story to light? Have there been specific challenges or arguments or, I don't know, counter views that have made it difficult for you?
Since, as I told you earlier, since this gives us a unique opportunity to move forward, so I prefer not to hide some of the things I feel you should know. The Igbos did not. I wish that some people I could ask to tell their stories are here. An Igbo never knew that a Jew did not know him.
Mm.
We thought we were Israeli citizens. That's what we thought we were. And a friend of mine was living in Greece. He got up in the morning, went to a synagogue. Fortunately, the rabbi there was a smart guy, older. So he said, African, you said you are from Israel. You said you are Israelites. The guy said, yes, we are Igbo. He said, Biafran, come and sit down. But after Igbos began to embrace Jews and they were turned away, we began to see Igbos who began to claim we don't have Israelite roots. Since all we have had is rejection, rejection, rejection. Not just rejection of not come to our synagogue, but denying the identity, denying that the Igbos came from Israel. And that is the most annoying thing that could happen to some Igbos.
Maybe this is an obvious question, and you may have told me personally before, but I don't recall. Do the Igbos consider themselves one of the 12 tribes that we used to speak of as the lost tribes?
I'm not bragging. I'm the expert on this subject. We are constituted of the 12 tribes. And it's not every Igbo that has the knowledge I have. It is not every Igbo in the world that has the knowledge I have, because I have spent 30 years on this subject. Yeah. We are constituted of the 12 tribes. That is why we took the identity Hebrew, because the Hebrews are the 12 tribes.
So it's not
I
one
know,
particular tribe.
yes,
It's not like saying we're the lost tribe of Dan or something like that.
no. For one, we should also know the origins and the basis of the idea of lost tribes is racist. It's usually used to put down groups that are not Europeans. It's not respectful. People that are very informed will feel offended if they are referred to as lost tribes. Because
Well, I know that now. And I also know that many of the communities that Kulanu works with have traced themselves back to specific tribes. We know that all the tribes weren't dispersed, right? But we know that within Israel proper, we speak of 2 tribes of having remained and 10 having been forced out. So that's why it's not an unusual question. Whether they were found in northern Burma or they were found somewhere else, they were seen to have been dispersed.
And the interesting thing is that the Judean among the Igbos is still retaining the name Judah. One of my neighbor in Abuja came from Uda.
Aha.
He's from Judah.
Interesting. Wow. You spoke about the Israeli government having raised barriers, right, to the recognition of Igbos. Is it still a problem for someone who is Igbo to I guess to make Aliyah? Is that what it comes down to?
These questions don't have easy answers. What Igbos thought initially, what Igbos we are thinking, was that they were you. I don't know how to explain this thing. Igbos we are thinking that they are Israeli citizens, not just Jews. They were thinking, oh, our brothers have recreated their country, it's also our country.
Right.
But when they were pushed away. So I don't know how to explain this thing, because if it's narrowed down to Aliyah, the history before all this will be forgotten, like when Israelis began to put up Moshavim and Kibbuzim in Igbo land. They were putting up Moshavim and Kibbuzim in Igbo land. So really? What were they thinking? They also saw that place as home.
So maybe instead of in the early days when they said that the Jews were offered Uganda, they should have been offered a place in Nigeria, maybe we'd be having a different discussion today, right?
When Azikiwe was in power, Azikiwe was in power with Michael Okpara, the Israelis, like Igbo land was a second home to them. The 4 Kibbuzim and Moshavim had already started rising up. Wow. Then Biafra happened and everything fell apart.
Right. What I think is instructive here, if I can jump in, because it was asked in an earlier question when Remy was presenting, 2 things. First of all, are all the Jewish communities across Africa, notwithstanding those who are recently converted, but the Lemba and the B'nai Israel of Ethiopia and the Igbo, are they historically / genetically related? Do any of you know, Holly or Bonnie or Remy, is there a connection there?
My own research, I wish I could, I wish the boy is here, because my friends laughed, my friends continued laughing. I had the DNA of my son analyzed. My son is like you, an Ashkenazi. His Ukrainian is more than West African. And my own DNA, if you go to GetMatch, I have more Latvian and Ukrainian. And of course, we know that a lot of Sephardim became Igbos.
Right.
But color is making people to think, oh no, they're African, so they will all be the same. The history is completely different.
There is a wonderful book called The Children of Abraham that actually supports what you're saying. I can't even remember the author. One author, there's 2, is a geneticist from Canada who I think made Aliyah. And the point they make is that skin color has nothing to do with your genetic makeup in determining your history. It's one factor, but it's not the factor. And they talk in this book about the genetic connection between all the Jews, regardless of really superficial facial characteristics or color, which I think is a fabulous concept. In other words, when he argues that while we say we're not a race, which is what Hitler claimed when he wanted to massacre all of us, he argues there is a race. The Jewish race is genetically connected, but it has nothing to do with distinguishing characteristics that have been used to define racial groups.
You know, a few years ago, we thought that genetics had solved all the problem. But the solution to the problem is still lying in history and culture. Because, just as Bonnie said, the DNA, ever before experts even began to find very serious loopholes in the idea that a Jewish DNA exists. Of course, it doesn't exist. Because if there is a Jewish DNA, why wouldn't Esau have it? Esau, he would have it. So even before the experts waded in and discovered that the idea that a Jewish DNA exists is wrong, I had already written that no such thing will exist. But DNA can help us to say this group was here. For example, what DNA did in my own case was prove that there was a migration from Israel through the desert. Nothing beyond that.
Right.
If you go to Saudi Arabia, if you go to Armenians, you will have that same DNA that you find in Remy, because they were also in the Middle East.
But I think what you're also supporting is what you alluded to, Remy, when you talked about, how did you describe it? This whole paradigm that is driving, I don't know about Europe, but North America crazy, the diversity, equity, and inclusion deriving from critical race theory that has placed Jews as white people and white people as oppressors, and you address that. And I think the most damaging paradigm that we're dealing with in society today is exactly that paradigm, that somehow race and categorization of people by color has anything to do with the results, the facts of today, or the results of society or economics or anything else. I mean, I just think it's a horrible paradigm that's been laid on our educational system at all levels, very destructive. And it does obviate the fact that there were Arab empires, Indian empires, Chinese empires, or the Persian Empire or the Ottoman Empire. It presumes the only empire that existed and the only colonialists were white people, which is all nonsense. So I really appreciate how you brought that into the story as well. The last question that I would ask here is, with regard to your own studies, is there another, you mentioned the idea of having like an Igbo affairs department. So there is something called Jewish studies. I guess that's what you're in. Is there now an interest in the Judaic study field, the discipline of Jewish studies, that will look more into the history of the Igbo and other African groups? Is that a rising field?
I suppose it's a rising field. Yeah, and the steps are being taken. Steps are being taken to harmonize Jewish and Igbo studies. Yeah, so we are also advocating that the same steps be taken in apart from studies in activism and so on and so forth, because we are dealing with rather a unique community that still retains most of the characteristics that the only thing it lacks is sovereignty. We still have a land. We still have 50 million people attached to that land. We still have a religion which you can actually find compelling evidence that it produced Judaism.
And is the language of the Igbos distinctive in Nigeria as well?
100%, and I think I said it in passing, 15 out of every 20 Igbo and Hebrew words have serious connections. A Yoruba woman in this case, studying at the University of Ibadan, the thesis is still there at the university. Compare the Igbo and Hebrew. You know what she arrived at? Her professor said both languages are genetically related. Wow. But what's happening is still part of anti-Semitism to be suppressing the Igbo story. like before, it was it was what the anti-Semites were doing before was the Igbos are Jews, kill them. But now the state of Israel is successful, Ashkenazi Jews, Sephardic Jews are successful. If we admit that they are related to Jews, those people may help them. So anti-Semites are now saying Igbos are not from Israel. At my latest presentation, I mentioned what Yeremiyahu Danzig said. He said, why is it only the Igbos and the Ashkenazim that people are doubting their Israelite ancestry? Only these two groups, the two largest, the two that can actually make a difference. Why is everybody in the world saying the Igbos are not Israelites, the Ashkenazim are not Israelites? He said these two groups should think.
Yes, and who else could be, right? So we want to welcome the 50 million. We sure need the numbers. That would be wonderful. Thank you, Remy, for a fantastic presentation. And thank you, everyone who has joined and stayed with us. And be well and safe, everyone, until we meet again. Thank you. Again, thank you to all of our sponsors. We had the pleasure of hearing from people in communities across the US and Canada. Thanks again.